What warning signs did everyone around you miss until it was too late? Mom's headaches started in October, the same week we moved into the rental house on Berkshire Street. She'd press her fingers against her temples during dinner and say the new commute was killing her. Dad suggested she take ibuprofen and get more sleep. By November, she was taking 6 pills a day and sleeping 9 hours a night, but the headaches kept getting worse. I watched her wince every time she turned her head too fast, watched her close her eyes against the kitchen lights like they were physically painful. She started wearing sunglasses inside the house, claiming the overhead fixtures gave her migraines. Dad bought dimmer switches and installed them in every room, thinking that would help. Dad's personality changed around the same time, but so gradually that nobody noticed at first. He'd always been patient, the parent who helped with homework and taught us to ride bikes without losing his temper. But suddenly, he was snapping at my younger brother Leo for leaving shoes in the hallway. He'd yell at my sister Ivy for talking during dinner. He'd slam cabinets and mutter under his breath about things that never bothered him before. Mom said he was stressed about work. His construction company had lost a major contract and money was tight. I said he was being an asshole. Neither of us was right. But the explanation seemed to fit. And when explanations fit, people stopped looking for other answers. Leo turned 6 in November and stopped being the sweet kid who shared his toys and hugged everyone. He started hitting Ivy when she touched his stuff. He'd scream and throw things when Mom told him to brush his teeth. His kindergarten teacher called to say he'd bitten another student during circle time, leaving teeth marks deep enough to break skin. Mom took him to a child psychologist named Dr. Melissa Frost, who said it was normal adjustment to the new house, normal sibling rivalry, normal developmental phase. Dr. Frost gave Mom a handout about positive reinforcement techniques and scheduled follow-up appointments. Everything was normal, except it wasn't normal at all. But Dr. Frost had seen hundreds of aggressive kindergartners, and Leo looked like just another case. Ivy was 8, and suddenly couldn't stay awake. She'd fall asleep during cartoons, during car rides, during dinner with her face nearly in her plate. The pediatrician ran blood tests checking for anemia, thyroid problems, vitamin deficiencies. Everything came back fine. He said she was probably growing. Kids need lots of sleep during growth spurts, he explained, showing Mom a chart about childhood development. But Ivy wasn't growing. She was getting thinner, losing weight even though she ate the same amount. Her teacher sent notes home saying Ivy was sleeping through math class and had stopped turning in homework. Mom made another appointment, and the pediatrician suggested depression. Maybe Ivy was sad about the move. Maybe she was being bullied at the new school. He recommended talking to the school counselor. I was 16 and trying to hold everything together while my family fell apart around me. I'd always been the responsible one, the straight A student who never caused problems. Varsity soccer team captain, honor roll every semester. College applications already researched and organized. But my grades started slipping in November. I couldn't focus in chemistry class. I'd read the same paragraph 5 times and not retain a single word. My best friend Derek asked if I was okay, and I said yes, because I didn't know how to explain that my entire family was sick and nobody could figure out why. He said I seemed distant and distracted. I said I was fine and changed the subject because what else could I say? The house was nice enough on the surface. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, updated kitchen with stainless steel appliances. The landlord was a guy named Raymond Kemp who owned 6 rental properties around town. He'd shown us the place in September with a practiced smile and promises that he took care of any maintenance issues immediately. Mom had loved the hardwood floors and the big windows that let in afternoon light. Dad had loved the garage for his tools and the yard for Leo to play in. We'd signed a 1-year lease and moved in October 1st, thinking we'd found a great deal. The rent was $400 less than comparable houses, and Raymond said he kept prices reasonable because he believed in helping families. By December, I was researching our symptoms online late at night when everyone else was asleep. Mom's chronic headaches, Dad's irritability and mood swings, Leo's aggression, Ivy's lethargy, my concentration problems. Every medical website I found had different explanations. Stress, depression, flu, vitamin deficiency, mold exposure, seasonal affective disorder. The more I read, the more confused I got. I made a list of all our symptoms and tried to find a pattern, creating a spreadsheet with dates and severity ratings. Nothing made sense. The symptoms were too varied, too non-specific. I felt like I was trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces came from different boxes. I showed the list to Mom one Saturday morning when she was drinking coffee and rubbing her temples with that pained expression I'd come to recognize. I think something's wrong with all of us, I said, sliding the printed spreadsheet across the kitchen table. Look at this. We're all sick at the same time. That can't be a coincidence. She glanced at the paper with tired eyes and said, everyone gets run down in winter. It was cold and flu season. We were adjusting to a new house and new routines. The holidays were stressful. She promised we'd all feel better once we got through Christmas and New Year's. She added my symptoms to her mental list of things to worry about, but not prioritize. Dad told me to stop playing doctor when I tried to show him the research I'd printed. You're not a physician, Nathan. You're a teenager who spends too much time on the internet. He said I was being dramatic and making everyone more anxious with my theories. Your mother has migraines. Leo's acting out because he's 6. Ivy's tired because kids get tired. and you're having trouble concentrating because you're on your phone until midnight every night. Each symptom had a simple explanation when you looked at them individually. It was only when you saw them all together that the pattern emerged. But Dad was too angry and confused to see patterns. He was too busy fighting with himself about why he couldn't control his temper anymore. The school counselor, Ms. Ramirez, called me into her office in mid-December after I failed 2 tests in the same week. She was a kind woman in her 50s who'd been counseling students for 20 years and thought she'd seen everything. She asked about home life, and I told her everyone was sick. "Define sick," she said, leaning forward with professional concern. I explained the headaches and the anger and the sleeping and the aggression. She nodded sympathetically and said, "Your parents are getting divorced, aren't they?" I stared at her in confusion. "No, they're not divorcing. They're just both really stressed, and my dad's been acting weird and everyone's having all these symptoms." Ms. Ramirez made notes in her file and said family stress affects students in many ways. She recommended I focus on self-care and not take on my parents' problems. She gave me a pamphlet about children of divorce, even though I insisted my parents weren't divorcing. She completely missed what I was actually saying because she was hearing what she expected to hear based on years of experience with stressed teenagers. Our family doctor was worse. Mom took all 4 of us for a checkup in January when Leo's school threatened to send him home if his behavioral issues didn't improve. Dr. Jeremy Williams had been our doctor for 8 years and knew our whole medical history. He examined each of us separately, asked basic questions about sleep and appetite and stress levels, took blood pressure readings. He prescribed antidepressants for Dad's mood swings, saying middle-aged men often experience depression. He referred Mom to a neurologist for her headaches, thinking maybe it was something structural. He said Leo needed behavioral therapy and possibly medication for ADHD. He said Ivy needed more iron in her diet and should see a sleep specialist. He told me to get more exercise and reduce screen time, standard teenage advice. 4 different diagnoses for 4 different people, never once considering we might all be sick from the same thing. But Dr. Williams was following his training. Rule out common things first, treat symptoms as they present. He was doing everything right according to medical protocol and still completely missing what was killing us. Derek started avoiding me at school because I was always complaining and bringing everyone down with negative energy. He said I'd changed, that I wasn't fun anymore, that I was obsessed with everyone being sick when maybe we were all just fine, and I was the problem. One day at lunch in late January, he moved to a different table without explanation. When I asked why, he said he needed a break from my constant negativity. He stopped inviting me to hang out and started eating lunch with different friends. I wanted to be angry at him, but I was too tired. Everything required so much energy I didn't have. Walking to class felt like running a marathon. Holding a conversation felt like solving calculus problems while drowning. The dog died in February. Bailey was a 5-year-old golden retriever who'd been healthy his entire life. He started refusing food in January and throwing up in the house. Mom took him to the vet twice. The vet ran blood tests and x-rays and couldn't find anything obviously wrong. She said maybe he'd eaten something that upset his stomach, maybe he was stressed from the move, maybe he needed time to adjust. Then one Monday morning I came downstairs at 6:30 to get ready for school and found Bailey dead in his bed by the heating vent. His body was still warm. Mom was crying when the vet said it was probably his heart, that sometimes young dogs have congenital defects that don't show symptoms until suddenly they do. Sudden cardiac death happens in dogs just like in people, the vet explained. You couldn't have known. You couldn't have prevented it. These things just happen sometimes. Mom paid for the cremation and brought Bailey's ashes home in a wooden box that she put on the mantel. I stood in the kitchen staring at Bailey's empty bed and felt something click into place in my brain. The heating vent. Bailey always slept by the heating vents because he liked being warm. We'd all been spending more time near heat sources because winter was cold and the house was drafty. The furnace ran constantly, cycling on every 20 minutes, trying to keep up with the temperature we'd set on the thermostat. I'd noticed because the sound woke me up at night, that low rumble of machinery in the basement. I went down there and looked at the furnace for the first time since we'd moved in. It was old, maybe 30 years, with rust spots and patches where someone had tried to repair it multiple times with metal tape and sealant. I didn't know anything about furnaces, but I knew it looked wrong. The metal housing had discolored patches, and the pipes had residue around the connections. I told Dad the furnace looked dangerous and maybe we should have it inspected. He was making coffee and barely looked up from his phone. He said Raymond had it inspected before we moved in and it was fine. I said Bailey died right next to a heating vent, and maybe that wasn't a coincidence. Dad's face went red, and he slammed his coffee mug on the counter hard enough that it cracked. The dog had a heart problem. The vet said so. Now drop it. I'm sick of your conspiracy theories about every damn thing. His anger was so disproportionate to what I'd said that it scared me. The dad I'd known my whole life wouldn't yell at me for being concerned about safety. He wouldn't break dishes and swear at his son over a simple question. But I didn't know yet that the poison was changing his brain, making him someone he didn't recognize. Mom's neurologist appointment in March found nothing wrong. Dr. Patel did an MRI and found no tumors, no structural abnormalities, no obvious cause for headaches that had persisted for 5 months. The neurologist prescribed different medications, stronger triptans, and preventive drugs that made Mom feel foggy and disconnected. She said sometimes chronic headaches don't have a clear diagnosis, that they fall into the category of primary headaches without underlying pathology. Mom came home with bottles of pills and cried in her bedroom. Through the door, I heard her tell Dad she felt like she was going crazy, that the pain was real, but nobody believed it was as bad as she said. Dad said maybe she should see a therapist because maybe it was psychosomatic. Maybe she was manifesting physical pain from emotional stress. Mom didn't talk to him for 2 days after that. Leo got suspended from kindergarten for 3 days after he threw a chair at his teacher during story time. Mrs. Hutchins had been teaching for 15 years and had never been afraid of a student before. But Leo had grabbed the small plastic chair and hurled it with force she didn't know 6-year-olds possessed. The chair hit her in the shoulder and left a bruise. The school psychologist, Dr. Ramon Delgado, said Leo was exhibiting signs of oppositional defiant disorder and needed intensive behavioral intervention. He might need medication. He definitely needed therapy. Mom and Dad met with teachers and counselors, and everyone had suggestions. Stricter discipline, rewards charts, consistent consequences, timeouts, natural consequences. Everyone had an opinion about what Leo needed, but nobody suggested that a 6-year-old who'd been sweet and gentle for his entire life, suddenly throwing chairs, might be sick instead of bad. Ivy stopped talking in March. Not completely, but she'd answer questions with one-word responses and spent hours just staring at the TV without really watching. Her teacher, Ms. Laura Grant, sent increasingly worried emails about Ivy's disconnection from class activities. She'd fall asleep at her desk. She'd forget her homework. She'd stare into space when called on. She seemed depressed, Ms. Grant wrote, and the school was concerned about her well-being. Mom made an appointment with a family therapist named Dr. Vincent Shaw, who specialized in childhood depression and anxiety. The session was a disaster. Ivy fell asleep on the therapist's couch 15 minutes in and couldn't be woken up. Dr. Shaw said that was a trauma response, that something was clearly wrong in our family dynamic, causing Ivy to shut down psychologically. He asked probing questions about discipline methods and family communication patterns. He asked if there was abuse or neglect happening at home. Mom was so offended she walked out mid-session and never went back. She called Dr. Shaw incompetent and said he was looking for problems that didn't exist. I started hallucinating in April. Small things at first. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision that weren't really there when I turned to look. Sounds like whispers when nobody was talking. Like the house itself was murmuring secrets I couldn't quite hear. I'd think I saw Bailey in his bed, and then remember he was dead. Once I saw him clearly in the hallway, his tail wagging, and reached down to pet him before my hand passed through empty air. I told myself it was stress and lack of sleep and grief about the dog. I didn't tell anyone because I was already the dramatic one, the WebMD doctor, the conspiracy theorist who thought the furnace killed our dog. If I admitted I was seeing things, they'd put me on antidepressants like Dad, and nothing would get better. I'd just be another person in the family with unexplained symptoms and bottles of pills that didn't help. The neighbors noticed something was wrong but drew all the wrong conclusions. Mrs. Patel from next door came over one Saturday in March with homemade samosas and asked Mom if everything was okay because she'd heard a lot of yelling coming from our house late at night. Mom said we were fine, just dealing with normal family stress. Everyone was tired and adjusting to the new neighborhood. Mrs. Patel nodded but looked unconvinced. Mr. Jefferson across the street mentioned to Dad that Leo seemed really aggressive when he played outside. He'd seen Leo push another kid off the swing set hard enough to make the kid cry. Had Dad considered testing Leo for ADHD, or maybe some kind of behavioral disorder? Dad said they were handling it and walked away. Nobody asked the right questions. Nobody connected the dots. They saw pieces of the puzzle but not the whole picture. Raymond Kemp came by in April to fix a leaking faucet in the kitchen, and I cornered him by his truck when he was loading his tools. I asked him about the furnace. He wiped his hands on his jeans and said he'd had it inspected annually, and it was safe. I asked specifically if he'd had it inspected since we moved in. He paused, just for a second, and said it wasn't necessary. Inspections were only required every few years by code. I asked if he'd install carbon monoxide detectors, because I'd been reading about how important they were in houses with gas furnaces. He laughed, actually laughed, and said the house already had smoke detectors, and that was sufficient. Besides, he said, CO detectors go off all the time with false alarms. They're more trouble than they're worth. You kids worry too much about things that aren't problems. He made me feel stupid for asking, like I was paranoid and immature. I went back inside, convinced I was overreacting. My grades were failing by May. I got a D in chemistry and C's in everything else. My college counselor, Mrs. Diana Ruiz, called me in to discuss how this would affect my applications. She was disappointed, the kind of disappointed that hurts worse than anger. She'd written my recommendation letters already, praising my academic excellence and leadership on the soccer team, and now I was making her look wrong. I tried to explain that I couldn't focus, that something was wrong, that my whole family was sick. She said a lot of students struggle with stress junior year and suggested I needed to develop better coping mechanisms. She recommended meditation apps and time management techniques and study groups. She gave me a book about overcoming perfectionism because clearly my problem was setting unreasonably high standards for myself. She never once asked why an honor student and team captain who'd never gotten below a B in his life was suddenly failing every class. She saw what she expected to see, a stressed teenager cracking under pressure, not a poisoned kid whose brain was suffocating. The hallucinations got worse. I'd see people in my room at night who disappeared when I turned on the light, shadow figures standing in corners watching me. I'd hear my name being called by voices that sounded wrong, distant and echoey like they were coming from underwater. Nathan, Nathan, over and over, but nobody was there when I looked. I'd feel like I was forgetting how to breathe and have to remind myself manually. Inhale, exhale, concentrating on each breath like it was a deliberate action instead of automatic. I'd wake up not knowing where I was or how I got to bed. I started writing notes to myself so I'd remember things. Monday, went to school, came home, ate dinner, did homework, bed. Without the notes, whole days would vanish from my memory like they'd been erased. Mom stopped going to work in early May. She'd been missing days here and there since March, calling in sick when her headaches were too severe to function. But the first week of May, she called in sick 3 days in a row, and her boss, Mr. Gary Thornton, said if she didn't come back with a doctor's note, she'd be fired. The school district where Mom worked as an administrative assistant had strict attendance policies. Too many people abused sick leave and they'd crack down. Mom went back to Dr. Williams, who'd been seeing her monthly and running tests that found nothing medically wrong. He wrote a note saying she had chronic migraines and depression and should be allowed reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Her boss was sympathetic but said she couldn't keep missing work indefinitely. They needed reliable staff. Mom cried in the parking lot of her workplace for 30 minutes before driving home. Dad's rage was constant now. He'd explode over nothing, over things so trivial that we all started walking on eggshells trying not to trigger him. A dish in the sink. Ivy leaving a crayon on the table. Me asking him a question when he was watching TV. He'd scream until his face turned purple and the veins in his neck stood out. He'd slam doors hard enough to rattle pictures on the walls. He'd punch walls and leave holes in the drywall that he'd stare at afterward like he couldn't believe his own hands had done that. Mom would try to calm him down and he'd yell at her too, saying she was enabling the kids. She was too soft. She was part of the problem. Leo would start crying, and Dad would yell at him to stop being a baby, stop being weak. The house felt like a powder keg, waiting for someone to light a match. We were all afraid all the time. I collapsed at school on a Friday morning in mid-May during the passing period between second and third period. 1 minute I was walking to English class with my backpack over one shoulder, thinking about the essay I hadn't finished. The next minute I was on the floor with teachers surrounding me asking if I could hear them. I couldn't remember falling. Couldn't remember anything except suddenly the ceiling was where the floor should be, and people were calling my name from very far away. Their voices sounded muffled like I was underwater. The school nurse, Ms. Patricia Wong, checked my pulse and said it was racing, over 120 beats per minute. She called an ambulance because my lips were turning blue, and she couldn't get my oxygen saturation above 88%. She stayed with me, holding my hand, talking to me in a calm voice that I could barely hear over the ringing in my ears. The ER at County General was busy and loud and too bright, fluorescent lights that made my head pound. A nurse with kind eyes and quick hands took my blood pressure and said it was too low, 90/60. She asked about medications and I said none. She asked about drugs, recreational substances, and I said no, never. She asked if I'd eaten today and I couldn't remember. Had I eaten breakfast? Had I eaten dinner last night? I couldn't pull the memories up. She asked if I was depressed, if I'd been thinking about hurting myself. I said everyone in my family was sick, all of us, for months. She made a note on her clipboard and moved on to the next patient. I lay on a gurney in the hallway for 40 minutes before a doctor came. 40 minutes of staring at ceiling tiles and listening to other people's emergencies and wondering if I was dying. Dr. Keisha Foster was young, maybe 30, and intense in a way that made you pay attention. She had her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She actually listened when I talked, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. I told her everything because she was the first person who seemed to really hear me. Mom's 5-month headache that neurologists couldn't explain. Dad's personality change from patient to violent. Leo's aggression that came from nowhere. Ivy's lethargy and weight loss. My hallucinations and memory problems. Our dog dying suddenly next to a heating vent. She asked question after question, writing everything down in fast shorthand, her expression getting more serious with each answer. Does anyone else in your family have these symptoms? Dr. Foster asked, underlining something in her notes. Yes, I said. Everyone. We're all sick. That's what I've been trying to tell people for months, but nobody listens. What kind of heating do you have? Dr. Foster asked suddenly. Forced air? Radiators? Heat pump? I said forced air with an old furnace in the basement. I described the rust spots and the metal tape and how the furnace ran constantly. She pulled out her phone and started Googling something, reading rapidly, scrolling through pages. Then she looked at me with an expression I'd never forget, a mixture of horror and urgency. Nathan, I think your whole family has carbon monoxide poisoning. We need to test your blood immediately and get everyone else here right now. Everything moved fast after that. Nurses drew blood from my arm with practiced efficiency and started me on oxygen through a mask that covered my nose and mouth. Dr. Foster called my parents personally, not the hospital operator, and told them to bring Leo and Ivy to the ER immediately. "Don't stop at home," she said firmly. "Don't go inside the house for any reason. Come straight here right now." She called the fire department and told them to check our house for carbon monoxide, gave them the address, explained the situation. She ordered arterial blood gas tests for all of us. Within an hour, my entire family was in the ER, all of us getting oxygen through masks, all of us having blood drawn from multiple sites. The test results came back within 2 hours. Carboxyhemoglobin levels measured how much carbon monoxide was in our blood instead of oxygen. Normal levels are under 2% for non-smokers. Mom's level was 28%, Dad's was 25%, mine was 31%, Leo's was 22%, Ivy's was 35%, the highest, probably because she was the smallest and spent the most time sleeping at home. Dr. Foster explained that anything over 10% causes symptoms. Anything over 20% causes serious cognitive impairment. Anything over 30% can cause permanent brain damage and death. We'd been poisoning ourselves slowly for 8 months, sleeping in beds while invisible gas filled our lungs and bound to our blood cells, slowly suffocating us from the inside out. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Foster said, and I could see she meant it. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted my oxygen mask. "Another few weeks and you'd probably all be dead. Carbon monoxide poisoning is cumulative. Your bodies couldn't recover between exposures because you were being exposed continuously. You were dying in slow motion and nobody could see it. The firefighters called from our house while we were being admitted to the hospital for hyperbaric oxygen treatment. They'd found carbon monoxide levels of 180 parts per million in the basement where the furnace was located. On the first floor where we spent most of our time, the levels were 95 parts per million. In the bedrooms upstairs where we slept, 120 parts per million. The acceptable level, the level that won't kill you, is 0. The level where symptoms start is 35 parts per million. We'd been living in a house with levels nearly 3 times that high. The firefighters had shut off the furnace and opened all the windows and doors. They'd used fans to air out the house. The source was a cracked heat exchanger that had been leaking carbon monoxide into our ductwork every single time the heating system ran. They'd found repair attempts dating back years, patches and sealants that had failed, evidence that the problem had existed long before we moved in. We spent 3 days in the hospital getting hyperbaric oxygen treatment. The treatment involved sitting in a pressurized chamber breathing pure oxygen at pressure higher than atmospheric. It forced the carbon monoxide out of our blood faster than normal breathing could. Mom cried the entire first day, partly from relief that we hadn't been going crazy, partly from horror at how close we'd come to dying. She kept saying, "I'm sorry," over and over to all of us, apologizing for not believing me when I said something was wrong. Dad was quiet, staring at the wall of the hyperbaric chamber, processing that his rage and violence hadn't been his fault. He'd thought he was becoming his own father, a man he'd sworn never to be like. Now he knew it was poison, not personality, but that knowledge didn't erase the memory of holes punched in walls and his children flinching when he raised his voice. Leo's aggression disappeared almost immediately once he was getting clean oxygen. The child psychologist who'd diagnosed him with ODD came by the hospital and looked at his chart in disbelief. The same child who'd thrown chairs and bitten classmates was now sitting quietly doing coloring books. His normal sweet self returned like flipping a switch. Dr. Frost apologized to Mom, said she'd never considered environmental causes for behavioral changes. She'd focused on psychological explanations because that was her training, her expertise. She'd missed a medical emergency because she was looking through the wrong lens. Ivy slept for 16 hours straight once we started treatment and woke up talking normally for the first time in months. She asked questions, told stories about school, engaged with us in ways she hadn't since January. Mom cried watching her, realizing how much of Ivy we'd lost, how much of our little sister had been stolen by poison we couldn't see or smell or taste. But the relief was short-lived. The doctors were still running tests on Ivy because her exposure levels had been the highest and lasted the longest. The doctor who oversaw our treatment was Dr. Ling, a toxicologist who specialized in environmental poisonings. He was in his 50s with gray hair and a gentle manner that made bad news slightly easier to hear. He explained that carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin more than 200 times more efficiently than oxygen. When you breathe it in, it replaces oxygen in your blood, effectively suffocating you from the inside out. Low-level chronic exposure causes all the symptoms we'd experienced. Headaches because the brain isn't getting enough oxygen. Confusion and memory problems because brain cells are dying. Personality changes because the frontal lobe that controls impulse and emotion is starved. Aggression and mood swings because the whole nervous system is under stress. Lethargy because the body is conserving energy for essential functions. Hallucinations because the brain is trying to make sense of incomplete sensory information. The symptoms are so varied and non-specific that doctors often misdiagnose it as flu or depression or stress, Dr. Ling explained during a meeting on our second day. We call it the silent killer because you can't detect it without specialized equipment. It has no smell, no taste, no color, By the time people realize what's happening, they're often already unconscious or dead. He said the real tragedy was how many warning signs we'd all missed. You did everything right, he told me specifically on day 2, pulling up a chair next to my bed. You recognized everyone was sick. You documented symptoms. You tried to warn people. But carbon monoxide poisoning is uniquely insidious because the symptoms mimic so many other conditions. Every doctor who saw you was looking at individuals in isolation, not at the family unit as a system. They missed the pattern because patterns are hard to see when you're only looking at one piece at a time. He explained something that made my stomach turn. Everyone who'd come to our house had been exposed too, just in smaller doses. Ms. Ramirez when she did the home visit to assess my family situation, Dr. Williams when he made house calls to check on Mom, Dr. Shah when he met with us for family therapy before Mom walked out, even the neighbors who came over for coffee or stopped by to chat, they'd all been getting low-level CO exposure that made them just slightly less sharp, just slightly less able to think clearly. The poisoning had literally impaired the judgment of everyone trying to help us. They'd been making decisions about our welfare while being subtly poisoned themselves. The worst news came on day 3. Ivy's MRI showed damage to her hippocampus and basal ganglia from prolonged exposure to carbon monoxide. The hippocampus controls memory formation. The basal ganglia controls movement and some cognitive functions. Dr. Ling said she'd likely have permanent effects, including memory problems and learning difficulties. She was 8 years old and would need educational support for the rest of her life because we'd been breathing poison for 8 months and nobody figured it out in time. The damage is done, Dr. Ling said gently, showing Mom and Dad the brain scans with dark spots where there should have been healthy tissue. Her brain was developing during this period, and the lack of oxygen affected that development. With therapy and educational support, she can adapt and compensate, but she'll never be quite where she should have been without the exposure. Mom collapsed in the hallway outside Ivy's room, just completely fell apart, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Dad held her while doctors and nurses walked around them, giving them privacy in the middle of a busy hospital corridor. I sat against the wall and watched my parents break and knew we'd never be the same. How could we be? We'd survived, but we'd lost something too. Ivy's potential, our innocence, our trust that the world was safe. Mom and Dad both showed cognitive impairment too, though less severe than Ivy's. Memory problems that Dr. Ling said might improve but might not. Difficulty with executive function, with planning and organizing and making complex decisions. He said they'd recover most of their abilities, but might never be completely back to baseline. The brain is remarkably adaptive, he said, but it's also fragile. Sometimes damage is permanent. I was lucky, Dr. Ling told me. My symptoms were reversible because I'd been spending less time at home than everyone else. My soccer practices after school, going to Derek's house when things got tense, avoiding family dinners when I could, all of that had literally saved my brain. The distance I'd created to escape my family's problems had protected me from the worst of the poison. The irony wasn't lost on me. My attempts to escape had been my survival. The fire marshal's investigation revealed that Raymond Kemp had been getting complaints about the furnace for 3 years. Previous tenants had reported feeling sick, having headaches, noticing strange smells. They'd called Raymond multiple times asking for repairs. He'd sent someone to look at it who'd patched the heat exchanger with sealant and tape instead of replacing it. One family had moved out early after 6 months, breaking their lease and forgiving their security deposit just to get away from the house. They'd been convinced the house was making them ill, but couldn't prove it. Raymond had kept their deposit claiming damages and rented to us 2 months later. The inspection documents Raymond showed us before we signed the lease were fabricated. Fire Marshal Douglas Crane traced the inspection company listed on the certificate. It didn't exist. The business license was fake. The certification stamps were fake. Raymond had created an entire paper trail to convince tenants his properties were safe when he knew they weren't. Fire Marshal Crane found similar issues in 2 of Raymond's other rental properties. Other families had been poisoned and never knew why. Some had moved out thinking they were the problem. Others were still living there, still being poisoned, not yet sick enough to connect the dots. The police charged Raymond with 6 counts of reckless endangerment, fraud, and falsifying safety documents. Detective Maria Ortiz from the Criminal Investigations Unit came to the hospital to take our statements. She was thorough and professional, and clearly angry on our behalf. She'd seen a lot of landlord negligence cases, but this was different. This was knowingly and deliberately putting families at risk over and over because replacing a furnace would cut into profits. He's been doing this for years, she said. We're finding evidence of complaints and cover-ups going back to when he first started renting properties. This isn't an oversight. It's a pattern of criminal negligence. The district attorney, Michael Zhao, held a press conference announcing the charges. He said Raymond had endangered multiple families over multiple years to save money on furnace replacement. The heat exchanger that poisoned us would have cost $3,000 to replace. Raymond collected $2,400 per month in rent from our house alone. He'd chosen to risk our lives, to risk killing children, to save the equivalent of 6 weeks of rent. That calculation, that cold arithmetic of profit versus human life, made the crime especially egregious. We sued Raymond in civil court while the criminal case proceeded. My parents' attorney was a woman named Patricia Alvarez who specialized in premises liability and had handled dozens of cases against negligent landlords. She was fierce and meticulous and deeply invested in making sure we got justice. She collected medical records from all 5 of us, testimony from Dr. Foster and Dr. Ling, fire marshal reports documenting the furnace defect, and evidence of Raymond's pattern of negligence spanning years. She found the family who'd broken their lease early, and they testified about their symptoms that disappeared after they moved out. Their 6-year-old son had been having behavioral problems exactly like Leo's. Their daughter had been sleeping all the time like Ivy. They'd thought something was wrong with their family when it was the house killing them. The trial took 6 months, and every moment was documented by local media. Raymond's attorney argued that carbon monoxide poisoning was hard to diagnose, and my parents should have installed their own detectors. They claimed Raymond had no way of knowing the furnace was dangerous since inspections had been performed. Patricia demolished that defense by proving Raymond had falsified the inspections and ignored specific complaints. She brought in the previous tenants. She brought in Fire Marshal Crane, who explained in detail how the furnace had been improperly repaired multiple times. She brought in Dr. Ling, who showed Ivy's brain scans to the jury and explained in simple terms that an 8-year-old girl would never be the same because a landlord valued money more than human life. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found Raymond liable for medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages totaling $4.2 million. Raymond's insurance covered the first $1 million. He'd have to sell all his properties to pay the rest. His rental business was finished. His reputation was destroyed. Local news covered the verdict extensively, and other landlords scrambled to inspect their furnaces, terrified of similar lawsuits. The city council passed an emergency ordinance requiring carbon monoxide detectors in all rental properties within 30 days. Some good came from our suffering, at least. The criminal case ended with Raymond pleading guilty to felony reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison, which felt simultaneously too long and not long enough. 4 years for nearly killing 5 people and permanently damaging an 8-year-old's brain. But the prosecutor said it was a strong sentence for property-based charges and would serve as deterrent to other negligent landlords. Raymond showed no remorse at sentencing, just anger that he was being punished for what he called an unfortunate accident that could have happened to anyone. We never went back to the house on Berkshire Street. Dad hired movers to pack our belongings while the house aired out, but none of us could stand to be inside those walls again. The thought of breathing that air, even clean air now, made my skin crawl. We moved into an apartment with gas heat and immediately installed 5 carbon monoxide detectors, 1 in every room and 1 in the hallway. For months afterward, I'd wake up panicking in the middle of the night and have to check that the detectors were working. The steady green lights became the most comforting thing in my life, proof that the air I was breathing wasn't killing me. My memories of those 8 months are fragmented and unreliable, like trying to remember dreams. Dr. Ling said that's normal after CO poisoning. The brain forms memories improperly when it's not getting enough oxygen. I have journals from that time, a habit I'd kept since middle school, but reading them is disturbing. My handwriting deteriorates page by page, from my normal neat printing to shaky scrawls to barely legible scratches. My thoughts become increasingly disorganized. By May, I was writing the same things repeatedly and not realizing it. Something is wrong. Everyone is sick. Nobody will listen. Over and over, the same desperate message that nobody heard until it was almost too late. 3 years later, I'm pre-med at State University studying toxicology. I want to understand how invisible things can kill you, how to recognize patterns that others miss. My apartment has 4 carbon monoxide detectors, even though it's all electric and has no combustion sources. I test them weekly, pressing the button and listening for the beep that means they're working. My roommate thinks I'm paranoid until I tell him why. Then he goes out and buys more detectors for his parents' house. That's what survival looks like sometimes. Hypervigilance masked as caution, trauma masked as preparedness. Ivy is 11 now and reads at a 2nd grade level despite years of intensive therapy. She works with a reading specialist 3 times a week, has an IEP at school with accommodations for memory problems and processing delays. She'll never catch up to her peers, never have the life she was supposed to have before 8 months of poison damaged her developing brain. She's sweet and funny and tries so hard, and it breaks my heart every time she struggles with things that should be easy. My little sister, who wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up now, can't multiply single-digit numbers without counting on her fingers. She carries that damage every day and will carry it forever because adults failed to protect her. Mom teaches awareness classes now about carbon monoxide poisoning at community centers and schools, showing pictures of our family before and after, explaining the symptoms we all missed, begging people to install detectors and maintain their heating systems. She's made it her mission to prevent other families from experiencing what we did. She says if one family listens and installs a detector because of our story, if one child doesn't end up brain damaged like Ivy, then maybe what happened to us had some purpose. I still see her cry sometimes when she thinks nobody's watching, grieving for the daughter she lost and the family we used to be. I don't know if I believe in purpose. I believe in negligence and consequences and the 1,000 small ways systems fail to protect people. I believed that Raymond valued profit over lives, and nobody stopped him until he'd poisoned multiple families. I believed that every adult who dismissed my concerns was doing their best with incomplete information, but their best wasn't good enough. The warning signs were everywhere, and nobody saw them until it was too late. That's what keeps me awake some nights. Not the memory of collapsing or the hallucinations or the 8 months of slow suffocation, but the knowledge that I told people. I showed them the symptoms. I asked for help, and every single person we trusted explained it away. That's the real horror. Not that we were poisoned, but that we were poisoned while standing in rooms full of people who should have saved us, but couldn't see what was right in front of them.